Romans chapter 2, verse 12 through 16. By way of review, we go back to the start of chapter 1 and we remember that the Apostle Paul has been ordained by God as an apostle of Jesus Christ to teach the gospel. And the objective of Paul's preaching was to produce an obedient faith, chapter 1 and verse 5. Paul preached the gospel which had content, he tells us, at chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. The content of that gospel that saves is that it instructs an individual on how they can achieve the righteousness of God. That is the objective of the truth, or the gospel. Unfortunately, there was then, as there are today, those that exchange that truth for things that are not the truth, as he says at chapter 1 and verse 25. He begins at chapter 1 also at verse 18 talking about this. The problem with that, however, is that those who do such things, that is, exchange the truths of God for their own ways in life, they are left with absolutely no excuse for their disobedience. And so the Apostle Paul speaks of creation at chapter 1 and verse 20 and 21. He also speaks of the subject of nature at chapter 1 and verse 26 and 27. So when someone practices homosexuality, they go against nature. When someone sins, they go against the things that creation teaches. So these are going to be some of the things that we talk about in these particular verses at this session. So when we moved on into chapter 2, Paul says there's no excuse for anyone, whosoever they are, whether that person be a Jew or a Gentile, it doesn't matter. When truth is violated, there are going to be consequences. And if one dies in those sins, there will be eternal consequences. And again, it doesn't matter what the individual's skin color is. It doesn't matter what one's economic background is. It doesn't matter what country one was raised. Paul said at chapter 2 and verse 11, there is no respect of persons with God. So now we move to verse 12, and it's important that we understand those preceding verses because Paul begins verse 12 with a Greek gar. And we're going to run into this quite a bit in a study of the book of Romans. You run into it throughout a study of the New Testament as a whole. But the Greek gar there is generally a word used to explain a reason for a previous statement, or it may also in some context be used to strengthen a statement that has previously been said. So what Paul has just said is that everyone, whether Jew or Gentile, God's not a respecter of person, is going to be judged according to the truth. Remember what he said at chapter 2 and verse 2. And we know that the judgment of God is according to the truth. And we know that the truth is the gospel, Ephesians 1 and verse 13. And we're going to make the connection when we get to verse 16 of this chapter as well. But at chapter 2 and verse 8, he said, but unto them that are factious and obey not the truth, but obey unrighteousness, shall be wrath and indignation. So in light of these things, to strengthen the subject that God is not a respecter of persons, everyone is judged by the same criteria. You that are listening to this recording, and me, myself. For as many as have sinned, he says at verse 12, as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law. And as many as have sinned under the law shall be judged by the law. And this is a fascinating statement, because the word sin means to fail, do wrong, to commit error or sin. So if it is the case that someone like the Gentiles can sin not having the law, not ever having heard the gospel of Jesus Christ, if it is that case, then it stands to reason that they are subject and liable to keep it, even though they were not given it. That's fascinating, isn't it? He's going to explain this. And really what Paul's getting at is there's absolutely, there is an extended lack of excuse for the Jew that was actually given God's written laws. But the Gentiles were not given God's written laws, the Gentiles under consideration here. So It didn't matter, though, that the Gentiles didn't have it. As many as have sinned without law. And that idea of without law means not being given law. They don't have law. Without law, that means no law. Doesn't mean that they're not under law. It just means they were not given law. As many as have sinned, violated law, without law, shall also perish. That is, they'll be lost. They'll be ruined. They'll be destined to a miserable end. And that miserable end was described at chapter 2 and verse 8 when we noticed the word study there of compression and misery that those Greek words brought out. So it doesn't matter that an individual was not given a law. He's still going to be judged by the law, by law. And contextually, what we're going to see here is that the law under consideration from verse 12 through verse 15 is undeniably the gospel or the truth. So remember, Paul says there at chapter 2 and verse 2, God judges according to truth. And at verse 8, he says, if you don't obey the truth, then there's terrible things waiting for you. And now he says, as many as have sinned without law, contextually the truth, they're going to perish without the law. And then as many as have sinned under law or in the state or condition or position of being in the law, that would be the Jew contextually, he'll also be judged by the law. That is, he'll be condemned, he'll be sentenced, he is put in a court system and deemed ungodly and due the wrath of God as we saw in the previous verses. So whether Jew or Gentile, whether or not someone was given law or not given law, everyone is still going to be judged by the law. So maybe you can think about many excuses people give today about saying, well, maybe if I just don't know that something's a violation of God's word, then I'll get away with it somehow with God. Well, follow carefully the next couple of verses and we're going to see that that's just simply not the case. So we go on to verse 13 then, and Paul says, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of law shall be justified. Now, this verse helps us to see very clearly that the law under consideration here is the gospel or the truth. And the reason I can say that with such great confidence is not only do we find similitude between verse 12 and verse 2 and verse 8, but also, as we look at verse 13 here, we know that the Mosaic law did not justify. Remember, the word justify means to be deemed righteous. To be deemed righteous. And the only way one can be deemed righteous when everyone has sinned is through the gospel. So I know that the law under consideration here, or law, there is no definite article, the, in verse 13. When you read verse 13, it reads as following in the Greek. For not the hearers of law are just before God, but the doers of law. So there is no the law, the law. So the fact is Paul is saying is you can't be guilty of just being someone who hears things and doesn't do things. The law, the gospel, the truth demands obedience. Again, remember chapter 2, verse 8. But unto them that are factious and obey not the truth. Well, what is it that we are to obey? There is content in the gospel. Remember what we saw at chapter 1 and verse 17. When Paul, at verse 16, he spoke about the gospel. And at verse 17, he says, for therein is revealed a righteousness of God. So the gospel has content. I have to know the content of the gospel. And the gospel is a law. We're going to see when we get to Romans 3:27 that's referred to as the law of faith. At Galatians 6:2, the law of Jesus Christ. And on. Romans chapter 8 and verse 1, the law of the Spirit of life. So everyone is under or subject to this law, the gospel, the truth. And it's not going to be those who simply hear it but don't do anything that receive the reward that he talks about at verse 9 and 10. it's going to be the doers. Now that sounds a whole lot like what the apostle, or rather sounds a whole lot like what James said in James chapter 2 and verse 24. We're not saved by faith only, but by works also. So Paul and James are saying the exact same thing. Now let's skip ahead, if you would, to Romans chapter 9. And in Romans chapter 9, Paul makes a statement that I think helps us right here in understanding the relationship between the Gentile and Jew and the gospel of Jesus Christ and how they are approaching this. This is well ahead into the study, I know, but this will help us now in chapter 2. So Paul writes at chapter 9 and verse 30, "What shall we say then, that the Gentiles who followed not after righteousness attain to the righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith? But Israel, following after a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by works. They stumbled at the stone of stumbling." So we'll talk about that verse in more detail when we get there. But suffice it to say at this point that we see that the Gentiles, even though they weren't seeking after the righteousness of God that the gospel revealed, many of them wound up achieving it by faith, that is, out of truth, out of faith. So there was a relationship between what the Gentiles were doing, and we'll see in a moment, by nature and through their knowledge of things gathered by creation, as we saw in chapter 1 and verse 20 and 21. There is a correlation between those works that they were doing and the gospel truth. So this is really a beautiful section of the text here. Now we move on to Romans chapter 2 and verse 14. And Paul writes, "For," once again we see the Greek gar, it's over and over and over again. It becomes epexegetic is what it becomes. So we're having something build upon something else. The topic continues, and the Greek gar helps us to see that. Everything's interconnected here. We're not leaving the topic. So he says, "For when Gentiles that have not law do by nature the things of law, these not having law are a law unto themselves." So the Gentiles were not given the law. The Gentiles under consideration in Romans 2 here. They were not given the written gospel of Jesus Christ. They were not taught this by the apostles. But yet they found themselves in this situation of righteousness, as Paul will go on to say at chapter 9. And he brings that up again in chapter 10 and 11 as well, we'll see. But the question is, how do they do this? How would one do that without the written word? Well, he says they do it by nature. They did by nature the things of law. So let's talk about this word nature for a moment and how this works. The word nature comes from a Greek word that means natural qualities, constitution, character, native instinct, to be so and so by nature disposed to do so and so, or the natural thing to do, as you can see on the slide to my right here. Now, these natural instinctive things are a part of man that God grants us by creating us. He gives us this instinctive knowledge to know the difference between right and wrong. And these things of nature are not written in a book. Well, let's look at an example of this. You'll just have to follow very carefully to get this. Now, at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14, Paul says, "Does not nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him?" So he says, nature is teaching you something. Just as Paul said at Romans chapter 1, verse 20, creation is teaching you something. Creation, it doesn't have something that's written down. Neither does man's nature have something that's written down. So what these things are, the truths that are learned from creation and nature, are found by observation. So as one observes the creation that they live in, as compared to their nature, their instinctive know-how, knowledge of things that are right and wrong, when they compare all these things together in their observation, then there are conclusions drawn in the mind. For example, think about some Gentile living way back in these days that did not receive the gospel, and he had an opportunity to take his neighbor's wife. And he says within his conscience, he says, I can't do that because she belongs to him. She doesn't belong to me. And then again, maybe we would think about the example that Paul gave at Romans chapter 1, verse 26 and 27 regarding homosexuality. So here is a situation where this Gentile could participate in homosexuality, but within his mind he says, this isn't right. I observe throughout creation that animals produce after their own kind, and the way I got here in the first place was because a male and female came together. So it goes against nature, as Paul said at verse 26 and 27 of chapter 2, to practice homosexuality. Now, he didn't know that because the gospel taught him that it was something that was written that he was told. He knew that by nature. He knew that by the observation of creation. So he knew not to go over to his neighbor's field and steal his neighbor's cornfield, corn from his neighbor's cornfield, because his neighbor worked for that and his neighbor grew it. It wasn't his. So these are things that he knew by nature and by the observation of creation. I think a very good way of explaining this would be to think about the name Christ. If I were to ask you, tell me everything you know about Christ, and maybe somebody is sitting next to you and you ask them, or we all ask each other, tell everything you know about the word Christ, the name Christ. Let's just take that name and let's just think about this. Let's talk about it. What is Christ? And so someone says, well, Christ was the one who was crucified on the cross. He was the propitiation for our sins. He was resurrected into the heavens. He sits at the right hand of God. He's the king of the kingdom, the church. He is the head of the church. He lived in this life as a man. He preached the gospel of the kingdom. This individual was commissioned the apostles to go and teach. Any rate, the more and more you say things about Christ, and you pause for a moment and you think about what it is you've said, you realize that what you have said is the gospel, is the truth, is the law. And that's the way nature and creation works. The more and more I think about the observable creation and the nature that God gave me, and the more and more I put that into words, I come up with a gospel. So when these Gentiles performed these works in relationship to nature and creation, they were performing works of the gospel. Let's keep going though at verse 15. Romans chapter 2 and verse 15. He says, in that, now he's going to explain what he has just said at verse 13. For not the hearers of the law are just before God. Verse 14. For when the Gentiles that have not law do by nature the things of law. So he says, let's explain this further. In that, they find themselves justified. In that is, by the cause. So when Gentiles do the instructions of law, gospel, or truth, by nature and creation, they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Their conscience bearing witness therewith, and their thoughts one with another, accusing or else excusing them. So the word show is kind of fascinating here. That word show means to point out, give proof of doing, or to display. Isn't that exactly what Hebrews chapter 11 is all about? One manifests their true faith in God by performing works of obedience. If you don't perform works of obedience, then you show God that you don't truly believe in Him. You may remember what Jesus said at John 14:15. If you love me, keep my commandments. If you don't love me, then don't keep my commandments. If you don't believe that I am He, then don't keep my commandments. If you believe that I am He, keep my commandments. Many people say they know Jesus, 1 John chapter 2, verse 4, 5, and 6, but yet they're liars, and they prove themselves to be liars because they don't keep the commandments of God. That's what the Apostle John says, 1 John 2, verse 4, 5, and 6. So here he says that the Gentiles who were performing works of obedience showed, they proved the work of the law written in their hearts. So let's go back to Jeremiah chapter 31. This is kind of a fascinating thing here. At Jeremiah chapter 31, and beginning there at verse 31, the prophet of God says, "Behold, the days come, said Jehovah, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel." That new covenant is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that's what Jesus preached when he came into the world. "I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand, bringing them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them, said Jehovah. Now I gave them," God says, "the law of Moses, but they broke that law. I'm going to give them a new law." In verse 33 he says, "But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, said Jehovah, I will put my law." A covenant is a law. We're talking about law here in Romans chapter 2, verse 12, 13, 14, and 15. The law is the new covenant. The law under consideration at Romans chapter 2 here and Jeremiah chapter 31 is the law of Jesus Christ. It's the perfect law of liberty. It's the law of faith. It's the gospel. It's the truth. And he says, I'm going to put this law in their hearts. He says, I will put my law in their inward parts, and in their heart will I write it. And I will be their God, and they will be my people. And they shall teach no man, every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know Jehovah. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, said Jehovah, for I will forgive their sins, and their iniquities I will remember no more. So, what's under consideration here? We just noticed at Romans chapter 2 and verse 13 that justification was under consideration in relationship to the law, in relationship to what Jew and Gentile are doing. Justification is forgiveness of sins. It's the acquittal of sins. So this is beautiful, isn't it? You just have to follow, make the connections, and everything falls into its proper place. So he says at verse 16, we're at verse 15. In the day that they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Okay, that's what we just talked about. Then we look at the second part of verse 15. He says, their conscience bearing witness therewith, and their thoughts one with another, accusing or else excusing them. So the Gentile was doing things of truth in the gospel, of the law of Christ, by way of their understanding through nature and creation. And these things, that is the gospel, the nature and creation, were all one. And when this individual did things according to nature, creation, the gospel truth, then there was this comparison that was pleasing to the conscience. In other words, the individual did or performed a work or said something, and it didn't violate his conscience of knowing what's right and wrong by way of nature and creation, by way of truth. So the conscience bore witness therewith, with the truth. And there would be times when the Gentile, the one under consideration, did something to where his conscience accused him of wrong. You went over and took that corn from the field of your neighbor, and you shouldn't have done that. I know I should not have done that. I'm sorry for doing that. Or else excusing them in that I refrained from stealing from my neighbor or saying something that was slanderous about my neighbor. Anything that would go against nature, creation, or the gospel truth. So, again, very beautiful, isn't it? Now we get to verse 16. In the day when God shall judge the secrets of man according to my gospel by Jesus Christ. And this is the last verse we're going to discuss in this particular lesson because it really closes the loop, so to say, that we started with. And what is God judging all men by, whether Jew or Gentile? What is God judging everyone by, whether or not that individual knows the gospel or so says doesn't know the gospel? It doesn't matter who the individual is. It doesn't matter what their background. It doesn't matter what their knowledge is. Everyone's secrets, everyone's words and deeds will be judged according to my gospel. which is the truth. Now that's where we connect the gospel of truth. You can turn over to Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 13 and see the similitude between truth and gospel, but you can also look right here in the context. Paul says he judges the secrets of men according to the gospel. At chapter 2 and verse 2 he says, and we know that God's judgment is according to truth. Now you just have to want to miss that, I guess, if you don't see that. The gospel is the truth. The truth is the law that's under consideration here. And this law will be the thing that judges. And Jesus has a part in that, he says, by Jesus Christ. That's the Greek dia, by the instrument or means of Jesus Christ. You can see that in John chapter 12 and verse 48. That's the task that God the Father has given his Son. Okay, so we'll pause here at chapter 2 and verse 15. At chapter 2 and verse 16. And we'll pick up with verse 17 at our next lesson. Thank you for viewing.